Margaret Eleanor Whitmore was 32 years old when everything she thought she knew about herself was about to be tested in ways she never imagined possible. But before we dive into her extraordinary story, if you find yourself drawn to the untold histories of women who changed the course of the war, who risked everything when the world wasn't watching, subscribe to this channel. Because the most powerful stories are often the ones that almost never get told. The stories that should haunt us, inspire us, and remind us what ordinary people are capable of when extraordinary circumstances demand it. It was March 1943 when Margaret first received a letter, not through any conventional postal system, but through a contact who knew someone working in British intelligence. The letter was brief, written in what appeared to be mundane bureaucratic language, but Margaret understood immediately what it meant. They wanted her. The British Secret Service wanted Margaret Eleanor Whitmore, a woman who had spent the last 3 years trying to live as normally as possible in occupied France, to become something else entirely, something dangerous. Margaret's journey to this moment had begun long before the war, in a small town called Windermere in the Lake District of England. Her childhood there was marked by the kind of quiet privilege that made people underestimate her. She was a daughter of a mathematician and a botanist, raised in a household where languages were spoken as naturally as English, where books lined every wall, and where intellectual curiosity was encouraged above all else. By the time she was 16, Margaret spoke 5 languages fluently: German, French, Italian, Spanish, and Russian. It was a skill that would eventually make her invaluable, though she had no way of knowing it then. When war broke out in 1939, Margaret was working as a translator for the British Foreign Office in London. It was safe work, important work, but it was also mind-numbing in its routine. Day after day, she would translate intercepted German communications, diplomatic cables, and intelligence reports. She was brilliant at her job, meticulous in her attention to detail, but she felt the distance between herself and the actual conflict. The war was happening elsewhere, to other people. That changed when her childhood friend, Elizabeth, joined the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Elizabeth was killed in a bombing raid on an RAF station in Kent in 1941. She was 24 years old. After receiving the news of Elizabeth's death, Margaret knew she couldn't remain in her comfortable London office anymore. She began quietly asking questions, reaching out to contacts she had developed over the years, exploring whether there might be other ways to serve her country. What she didn't know was that she was already being watched. The British intelligence services had been monitoring her work for months, impressed by her linguistic abilities, and what they sensed was a deeper commitment lying dormant within her. After Elizabeth's death, when Margaret started making inquiries, the decision was made quickly. They would approach her. They would offer her something far more dangerous than translation work. They would ask her to become a spy. The recruitment process was nothing like what Margaret expected. There was no dramatic midnight meeting in a London alley. Instead, she was invited to what appeared to be a social gathering at a country estate north of the city. There were perhaps 20 other people there, all of them young, all of them intelligent, all of them carefully selected. It was during dinner that a man named Colonel Graves approached her. He didn't introduce himself as anyone official. He simply asked her questions about her languages, about her family, about why she thought the war was important, about what she would be willing to sacrifice. Margaret answered honestly. She didn't know what he was looking for, but she sensed that deception in that moment would be worse than any admission of doubt. She told him about Elizabeth. She told him about the feeling of helplessness that came from being safe while others died. She told him that she wanted to matter. She wanted her life to mean something beyond the comfortable confines of her class and education. 3 weeks later, she received official notice that she was being transferred to a new government department. The paperwork was vague about what exactly this new position entailed. She was told to report to a country house called Bletchley Park. Everyone who worked there signed the Official Secrets Act. The work was classified. She was not to discuss it with anyone, not even her family. When she arrived at Bletchley Park, Margaret quickly realized that this was the heart of British wartime intelligence. Here, thousands of people worked in absolute secrecy on projects so sensitive that even their colleagues in other sections didn't know what they did. She was assigned to Section F, which specialized in continental European operations. Her training began immediately. For 6 months, Margaret learned things she had never imagined needing to know: how to identify surveillance, how to lose a tail in crowded city streets, how to use dead drops to communicate without being detected, how to use forged documents and maintain a false identity, how to withstand interrogation, how to kill silently and efficiently. The last part disturbed her more than she wanted to admit, but she learned it anyway because she knew it might be necessary, and she had already decided that whatever doubt she had, whatever fear she felt, it could not stop her. What struck Margaret most during this period of training was not the tactical instruction, but rather the psychological preparation. The intelligence officers understood that being a spy wasn't simply about having the right skills. It was about being able to compartmentalize your mind, to separate your true self from the identity you were assuming, to live a lie so completely that it became indistinguishable from truth. They taught her meditation techniques. They taught her how to construct false memories, detailed internal narratives that would allow her to answer questions about a childhood she never lived, relationships she never had, experiences she never underwent. They taught her that the best lies are built on foundations of truth, mixed with just enough fiction to make them undetectable. By September 1943, Margaret had passed all of her training assessments. She was ready for deployment. But before she was sent into the field, she had to undergo a final psychological evaluation. She sat in a small room with a psychiatrist named Dr. Helen Winters, a woman in her 50s who had spent decades studying the human mind. Dr. Winters asked her questions for hours about her fears, about her motivations, about what she would do if she was captured, about whether she thought she would break under torture, about whether she was capable of killing, about whether she believed this war was worth the price she was about to pay. Margaret answered every question truthfully, as much as she understood the truth about herself. And at the end of it all, Dr. Winters said something that would stay with Margaret for the rest of her life. "You understand, Miss Whitmore, that once you go into the field, you will never truly be yourself again. Even after the war ends, even if you survive, part of you will remain the person you're about to become. That part of you will never come home." In October 1943, Margaret Eleanor Whitmore ceased to exist, at least officially. She was given a new identity: Margot Muller, a 35-year-old German widow living in occupied France. Her cover story was detailed and carefully constructed. Her husband, Klaus Muller, had been a Wehrmacht officer who died in Russia in 1942. She had been living in Lyon since 1941 with her teenage son, who was studying engineering. She had family connections in Germany, which explained her perfect German accent and cultural knowledge. She had been widowed by the war like so many women, and her grief had turned her inward. She was exactly the kind of woman that German occupation forces would pay no special attention to. On a cold October night, Margaret boarded a Lysander aircraft at an RAF airfield. These small British reconnaissance planes were equipped to land on improvised fields, making them perfect for depositing secret agents in occupied territory. As the plane climbed into the dark sky, Margaret looked down at the lights of England disappearing beneath the clouds. She thought about her parents, who believed she was working in a government office in London. She thought about Elizabeth, who would never come home from the war. She thought about the girl she had been, and she prepared herself for the person she was about to become. The plane touched down on a rough field outside Lyon at 3 a.m. Margaret parachuted from the aircraft, landing in a copse of trees. A cold rain was falling. The wind cut through the fabric of her coat. She had been trained for this, but training never fully prepares you for the actual moment. This was real. She was really here. She was really doing this. A figure emerged from the darkness. No words were exchanged. She was led through the rain to a small farmhouse. Inside, a woman named Louise, a member of the French resistance, provided her with fresh clothes and documents. Louise was in her 40s, with the kind of hardened, efficient demeanor that came from years of underground work. "You are Margot Muller now," Louise said in French, though she switched to German occasionally to test Margaret's accent and knowledge. "You will stay here for 3 days while I confirm your papers are in order. Then I will take you to Lyon. You will have a small apartment, nothing fancy. You will be a widow living quietly. You will make contact with our network within 2 weeks. Not before. The Germans are suspicious of anything too convenient. Those first 3 days in the farmhouse were among the most difficult of Margaret's entire operation. She couldn't simply relax and be herself, because now there was no self to be. She was only Margot. She had to think like Margot, remember like Margot, react like Margot. When Louise came to her in the evening and asked her questions about her fictional family in Berlin, Margaret had to remember the details she had memorized. Where did her mother live? What was her father's occupation? What was her favorite childhood memory? Margaret answered each question without hesitation, but inside her mind was a strange vertigo, as if she were watching herself from outside her body, seeing the stranger answering intimate questions about a life that had never existed. On the 4th day, Louise took her to Lyon. The city in late October was gray and cold and filled with the machinery of Nazi occupation. German soldiers moved through the streets with casual authority. French police collaborated with German officers. Posters covered walls, demanding information about resistance fighters. The penalty for helping them was death. At the center of the city, the Gestapo had established their headquarters in a commandeered hotel. Their black cars drove through streets like sharks patrolling dark water. Margaret's apartment was on a narrow street in the old town, above a butcher's shop. It had a small bedroom, a sitting room with a single window that looked out onto the street, a tiny kitchen, and a bathroom with cold water that rarely ran hot. The furniture was sparse and worn. The walls were thin enough that she could hear the neighbors' conversations and their footsteps. It was perfect for her purposes. It was the apartment of a woman without means, a woman trying to survive, a woman who had been broken by war. No German officer would think twice about someone living in such a place. For 2 weeks, Margaret lived as Margot would live. She went to the market to buy food. She sat in cafes and read German newspapers, letting her German accent become more natural through disuse of English. She attended a Catholic Mass, because the paper said Margot was Catholic. She took walks through Lyon in the gray October afternoons, beginning the process of learning the city's geography, memorizing escape routes, identifying places where she could disappear if necessary. She watched the German soldiers and tried to understand them, to see them not as monsters but as men, because understanding them would help her manipulate them. On November 1st, exactly 2 weeks after her arrival, Margaret made her first contact with the resistance cell in Lyon. It happened in a bookstore near the cathedral. She selected a specific German novel from the shelf and placed it on the counter. The bookstore owner, a man named Pierre, processed the transaction without comment. Under the book's dust jacket was a note. It contained a time and a location, an address in the industrial district. That evening at 7 o'clock. Come alone. The industrial district of Lyon was a maze of factories and warehouses set along the river. At night, it was dark and largely empty. German patrols were infrequent there, but the danger was omnipresent. Margaret made her way through the streets with her heart pounding, certain that every shadow concealed a watching soldier. She arrived at the address 7 minutes early and waited in a doorway. Exactly at 7, a car pulled up and a man gestured for her to get in. She did. The car drove for 10 minutes through residential neighborhoods before stopping in front of a townhouse. They went inside. There were 4 people waiting in the front room. Pierre, the bookstore owner, a woman named Antoinette who worked as a nurse, a man named Claude who was a factory foreman, and another man named Henri who didn't introduce himself or explain his role. It was Henri who did most of the talking. He was in his 60s, thin and intense, with the kind of eyes that had seen too much. He explained to Margaret what the resistance cell needed. Intelligence. The Germans in Lyon were well organized and efficient, but they didn't suspect a problem from within their own ranks. What the resistance needed was someone who could operate within German circles, someone who could access information. Margot Mahler, a German widow with family connections to Berlin, someone with no suspicious background in resistance, someone who could use her grief and her isolation as cover, could be very useful indeed. We have someone who can help you, Henri explained. His accent was Parisian, cultured, a German officer. He is tired of the war. He has begun to provide information to us. He is based at German Army headquarters in Lyon. If you could develop a relationship with him, If you can position yourself as a confidant, a sympathetic ear, you might be able to extract very useful intelligence from him. We're not asking you to seduce him, but we are asking you to befriend him, to make him trust you, to make him believe that you, a German widow, understand the burden he carries. Margaret understood what they were asking. They wanted her to become the fantasy of a lonely German officer. They wanted her to be the woman who understood him, who shared his background, who could offer him a refuge from the war through friendship and empathy. Whether that friendship remained purely platonic or developed into something more was left ambiguous. But the implication was clear. If necessary, she would have to use whatever tools she had available to gain his trust and his secrets. The officer's name was Klaus Reinhardt. He was 42 years old, a major in the Wehrmacht intelligence service. According to the information Henri provided, Reinhardt was a career military man who had grown increasingly disillusioned with the Nazi regime. He had lost his wife and 2 sons to a bombing raid on Berlin in 1942. He had no close family left in Germany. He spent most of his free time alone in his quarters, drinking and reading. He was lonely. He was vulnerable. He was exactly what the resistance needed. Margaret spent 2 weeks observing Klaus Reinhardt before approaching him. She learned his routines. He frequented a particular cafe on Thursday evenings, always alone, always sitting at the same table in the corner. On the 3rd Thursday, Margaret went to the cafe and sat at a nearby table, far enough away that her presence wouldn't seem threatening, close enough that they might naturally fall into conversation. She had learned that manufactured chance meetings are far more effective than planned introductions. They allow the target to believe they are making a choice, that any subsequent relationship is organic rather than orchestrated. Klaus didn't initially notice her. Margaret had dressed carefully that evening, in clothes that were elegant but not extravagant, that conveyed a certain refinement without drawing attention. She was reading a German book of poetry, deliberately positioned so that Klaus could see the cover. After an hour, as the cafe was beginning to empty, Klaus approached her table. He had noticed the book. It was a collection by George Trakl, one of his favorite poets. Could he join her? Of course, Margaret replied. They would be delighted. The conversation that followed was the first of many. Klaus was initially cautious, suspicious even, but Margaret was patient and careful. She never pushed. She simply listened. She shared her own carefully constructed sadness about her loss. She quoted Goethe and Schiller with the kind of intimate knowledge that came from genuine familiarity with German culture. She expressed doubts about the war, without ever explicitly criticizing the Nazi regime. She was a mirror image of Klaus's own secret doubts and sorrows. Over the course of 6 weeks, Margaret and Klaus fell into a pattern of meetings. Thursday nights at the cafe, Sunday afternoons in the park, walks along the river, always in public places, always maintaining appropriate distance. Margaret learned the details of Klaus's life. She learned about his dead wife, Helene, whom he described with tenderness that suggested their marriage had been a genuine love match. She learned about his sons, Friedrich and Otto, who had been 7 and 4 when they died. She learned about his family home in Bavaria, about his dreams of what his life might have been if there had been no war. And Klaus, without fully realizing what was happening, began to trust her. He began to see her not as Margot Muller, a German widow he had met by chance in Lyon, but as a kindred spirit, someone who understood, someone who shared his fundamental belief that this war was madness, someone he could be honest with about his doubts and fears. By December, Klaus was asking her to help him. He had documents, he said, intelligence reports that showed the true status of German military operations on the Eastern Front. The reports contradicted the optimistic official narratives. The Reich was losing ground. The victories they were told about were fabrications. Klaus wanted Margaret to help him get these documents to people who might be able to use them, people who might be able to convince those in power that the war needed to end before Germany was destroyed entirely. He didn't explicitly say he wanted to help the resistance, but that was what he meant. Margaret reported everything to Henri. The question now was what to do with Klaus. He was a valuable asset, but he was also increasingly vulnerable. He had grown paranoid, sensing that something was wrong with the intelligence reports coming from Berlin. He was talking about defecting, about leaving France entirely and trying to reach Switzerland, where he could disappear. But if he defected, the Germans would search for him. They would suspect everyone he had associated with. They would suspect Margaret. It was Antoinette, the nurse, who suggested the dangerous alternative. Klaus didn't need to defect. Klaus needed to die, not as suicide, which would raise too many questions and might cause the Germans to suspect something larger was happening, but as a simple death. A stroke, perhaps. Klaus did have high blood pressure. He did complain of headaches. A German officer, alone in his quarters in the evening, suffering a sudden heart attack or stroke, was hardly unusual in a country at war. Antoinette was not just a nurse. She was also trained in the use of certain substances. She knew poisons that were difficult to detect in a corpse, substances that mimicked natural causes. She suggested that Margaret slip such a substance into Klaus's drink. A small amount would be enough. Klaus would go home feeling ill, retire to bed, and never wake up. Margaret's reaction to this suggestion was visceral and immediate. She refused, not because of any abstract moral principle, though she had many of those, but because Klaus was her friend. Somewhere in the months they had spent together. Despite everything she knew about her own role, despite the fact that their relationship was fundamentally built on deception, Margaret had come to genuinely care for Klaus. She felt affection for him. She felt sympathy for him. She did not want him to die. The argument with Henri was fierce. He pointed out that Klaus was a German officer, that he represented a system that was murdering millions of people across Europe. He pointed out that sentimentality was a luxury that agents in the field could not afford. He pointed out that if Klaus was discovered to be working with the resistance, he would be tortured and executed. And more importantly, Margaret would be discovered and executed as well. Henri was not a cruel man, but he was a realist. In wartime, sentiment was a liability. In the end, Margaret did not poison Klaus. She chose instead to do something far more dangerous. She warned him. She told him that the Germans knew about his doubts, that he was under suspicion, that he needed to leave France immediately, that very night, and get to Switzerland before his betrayal was discovered. She provided him with money, a forged travel document, and the name of a contact in Geneva who would help him. Klaus understood immediately what this act of kindness meant. It meant that Margaret was not simply a German widow who had happened to befriend him. It meant that their entire relationship had been an operation, a manipulation. It meant that Margaret was part of the same system that had brought him to this moment of crisis and fear. He was devastated, more than devastated. He was broken. She could see it in his face. She could see the moment when hope died and was replaced with understanding. But Klaus did not betray her. Despite his heartbreak, despite knowing that she had played him, he did not go to the Gestapo. He took the money and the documents, and he left Lyon that night. Margaret never saw him again, though she later learned that he made it to Switzerland safely and spent the rest of the war working for an international relief organization. But that knowledge, though it brought her some comfort, did not erase the guilt. She had used him. She had broken his heart. And whatever her justifications, however necessary it had been for the war effort, she could not entirely absolve herself of that betrayal. What Margaret did not know was that Klaus's departure would trigger a chain of events that would put her in far greater danger than she had yet faced. German military intelligence had indeed been suspecting Klaus. Within days of his disappearance, the Gestapo arrived at his quarters. They seized his personal effects and his work files. They questioned his colleagues. And in the course of their investigation, they discovered records of his meetings with Margaret. They discovered photographs of the two of them walking together in the park. They discovered that Klaus had been spending significant time with a woman whose identity they were beginning to suspect was false. The knock on Margaret's door came at 3 a.m. She had been asleep, and for a moment as she opened the door to find 2 Gestapo agents in dark coats, she thought she might actually wake up. It couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But it was. The agents entered without invitation or explanation. They searched her apartment thoroughly and methodically. They found nothing incriminating, because Margaret had learned in her training to keep her safe house clean of any evidence of her true work. But they found her German papers, her identity as Margot Muller, and they informed her that she needed to come with them for questioning regarding her relationship with Major Klaus Reinhardt. The car ride to Gestapo headquarters was one of the longest journeys of Margaret's life. She sat in the back seat between two agents, and her mind raced through possibilities and contingencies. The Gestapo suspected her of being part of Klaus's defection plot. They did not yet know that she was a British agent. If she could convince them that she was simply a lonely German widow who had fallen for a man who had then betrayed her, she might survive this. But she also knew that the Gestapo did not accept simple stories. They tortured until they understood the entire truth. And once they had that truth, they executed you. The interrogation room was bare and gray. A single light hung from the ceiling, a table and two chairs, a drain in the floor that Margaret's mind immediately fixated on, imagining terrible purposes. The lead interrogator was a man named Sturmbannführer. He was thin and precise, with the kind of methodical cruelty that characterized the most dangerous of the Nazi intelligence officers. He asked her questions slowly, carefully, watching her face for signs of deception. How did you meet Klaus Reinhardt? When did your relationship begin? How often did you see him? What did you discuss? Did he ever mention his doubts about the war? Did he ever suggest that you help him with sensitive documents? Did he ever ask you to contact anyone on his behalf? Margaret had been trained for this. She had spent weeks at Bletchley Park learning techniques to resist interrogation. But training is never the same as reality. The fear is more real. The pain, once it begins, is more intense. And the fundamental desire to survive, to escape, to make the interrogation stop, is more powerful than any ideological commitment or professional training. She stuck to her story. She was a widow. She had been lonely. She had met Klaus by chance. They had become friends. He had confided in her about his doubts regarding the war. She had sympathized with him. She had warned him, out of care for him, that he should leave France. She had not thought of it as helping the enemy. She had thought of it as helping a friend. Sturmbannführer was skeptical. He suggested that her story was too convenient, too perfectly constructed. He suggested that she was a resistance member. He suggested that she was part of a larger conspiracy. He asked her repeatedly who had recruited her. Who did she work for? What was her mission? Margaret denied everything. Over and over, she insisted that she was simply Margot Muller, that she had no involvement with the resistance, that Klaus Reinhardt had simply taken advantage of her loneliness and her sympathy for him as a fellow German. On the second day of her interrogation, they brought Klaus in. They did not bring him to the interrogation room. They made sure that Margaret could see him through a window. Being led through a corridor, he was limping. There was bruising on his face. He had been tortured. The message was clear. If Klaus was being held, if Klaus was being tortured, then perhaps Margaret should reconsider the wisdom of maintaining her story. Perhaps she should become more cooperative. But Margaret realized something in that moment. If Klaus was alive, then the Gestapo did not have proof of his involvement with the resistance. Otherwise, they would have already executed him, which meant that Klaus's defection had been successful enough that they couldn't immediately prove it was orchestrated, which meant that the resistance network had not been compromised, which meant that if Margaret could hold out, if she could maintain her story, the Gestapo might eventually conclude that she was simply a dupe, a woman who had been manipulated by Klaus Reinhardt, someone not worth executing. That realization gave her strength. She had been trained to hold out under torture, but she had never truly believed she would have to. Now she did. And what was happening to Klaus was motivation to continue resisting, not to break. The torture began on the third day. Sturmbannführer used methods that had been refined over years of use. They were not trying to kill her. They were trying to break her will. They used electricity, applied to sensitive areas of her body. They used water, drowning her repeatedly and then reviving her. They used sleep deprivation, waking her every time she began to fall asleep. They used cold, keeping her naked in an unheated cell. They used pain, simple and direct pain, inflicted by men who had learned that the human body could endure an extraordinary amount of suffering before it gave up. And Margaret endured. She did not know how she was able to. She thought about Elizabeth. She thought about the millions of people who were dying in the war. She thought about the fact that her training had taught her that the human mind is capable of surviving things that should destroy it. She learned to leave her body, to retreat into a part of her mind where the pain could not reach her. She created false memories of childhood that she told her torturers, stories that were detailed enough to satisfy them that she was being truthful, but which revealed nothing of actual significance. On the 8th day of her interrogation, the torture stopped. She was returned to her cell. She was given food and water. She was allowed to sleep. She was given clean clothes and brought before Sturman Wolf in an interrogation room that did not smell of blood and waste. "We have made a decision," Wolf said. "We do not believe you are a significant member of any resistance organization. We believe you are a woman who was used by Klaus Reinhardt. However, we cannot simply release you. You are a security risk. Your file will remain open. If at any point in the future we discover that you are lying, if any evidence suggests that you've been involved in any anti-German activity, you will be executed. Do you understand?" Margaret nodded. She understood. She was not going to be executed. She was not going to be executed. She was released from Gestapo headquarters into the gray streets of Lyon on a cold December afternoon. She could barely walk. Every muscle in her body was screaming. Her hands were shaking. But she was alive. She had survived. Henri found her 3 days later. She had managed to send a coded message to the resistance, indicating that she had been compromised but not captured. Henri brought her new papers, a new identity, a new apartment in a different part of Lyon. She could not stay in France. The Gestapo might change their minds. Klaus might break under more torture. The situation was too dangerous. Margaret was evacuated from France on a cold night in January 1944. The journey was harrowing. She was smuggled to the countryside in the back of a supply truck, hidden beneath false floorboards. She traveled by foot through the mountains, guided by resistance members who knew the route. She crossed into Switzerland and made contact with British intelligence there. Within a week, she was on a train to London. When she arrived at the Bletchley Park complex, she was unrecognizable to the people who had trained her. She had lost significant weight. Her eyes had the distant, haunted quality of someone who had seen too much. She was reassigned to desk work, translating intercepted German communications, a role not unlike the work she had done before her deployment, except now she understood the true cost of that information. But the story of Margaret Whitmore did not end in Lyon. In fact, her most significant contribution to the war effort was only just beginning. Through her translation work, Margaret began to identify patterns in German communications that suggested something remarkable was happening. There were references to a research facility, being moved from Berlin to a location in Bavaria near the Austrian border. The communications were fragmentary and heavily encrypted, but Margaret's intimate knowledge of German military terminology and procedure allowed her to piece together what was being discussed. The facility, she realized, was related to German nuclear research. The Germans were attempting to build a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. And the communication suggested that the key personnel involved in this project would be gathering at a command center in Munich in February 1944. If the Allies could eliminate that command center, if they could kill the key scientists and military leaders involved in the project, they could potentially set back German nuclear development by years. Margaret brought her analysis to her superiors at Bletchley Park. She demonstrated the connections she had made, the patterns she had identified. She explained why she believed the intelligence was accurate. The analysis was reviewed by other officers. It was corroborated by other sources. Within 2 weeks, the decision was made to launch an airstrike against the suspected command center in Munich. On February 16, 1944, American bomber aircraft attacked a building in Munich that had been identified as the headquarters of the German nuclear research project. 73 German officers and scientists were killed in the raid. Among them were 3 of the Reich's leading physicists. The German nuclear research program suffered a catastrophic blow, from which it never fully recovered. The intelligence that had led to the targeting of that building had come from Margaret's analysis of intercepted communications. Her ability to understand German military procedures, her intimate knowledge of how German intelligence operated, her personal experience with German officers, had all combined to allow her to identify a pattern that other analysts had missed. Officially, Margaret's role in the Munich raid was never public. She was classified as part of a secretive intelligence operation. Her name was never mentioned in any official capacity. Her contribution was noted only in classified files that would remain sealed for decades. But within Bletchley Park, within the inner circles of British military intelligence, Margaret Whitmore became legendary. She was the agent who had survived torture by the Gestapo. She was the analyst who had identified a target that shifted the course of the war. But Margaret herself had been fundamentally changed by her experiences. After the war ended in May 1945, she was offered the opportunity to remain in military intelligence. She refused. She took a position as a translator for the United Nations instead, and later became a professor of languages at Oxford University. She married, had 2 children, lived what appeared to be an entirely normal life. But those who knew her well understood that part of her had remained in Lyon, in that interrogation room, in those moments when she was making impossible choices between survival and principle. Margaret lived until 1987, dying of heart failure at the age of 76. In her will, she left her papers, her diary from the war years, and her personal account of her service to the Imperial War Museum in London. It was only after her death, as historians began to examine these documents, that the full story of Margaret Whitmore's service emerged in the shadows of official secrecy. In 2001, a historian named James Richardson published a full biography of Margaret Whitmore, based on her personal papers and newly declassified intelligence files. The book revealed for the first time the full extent of her contributions to the Allied war effort. It revealed her undercover work in Lyon. It revealed her torture and interrogation by the Gestapo. It revealed her crucial role in identifying the German nuclear command center in Munich. It revealed the psychological cost of her service, a cost that followed her through the rest of her life. Today, Margaret Whitmore is recognized as one of the most important female intelligence agents of World War II. Her story stands as testament to the extraordinary courage and sacrifice of the women who served in military and intelligence services during the war. Women whose contributions were often hidden, whose names were often kept secret, whose sacrifices were often unrecognized. But their legacy remains. The work they did, the risks they took, the prices they paid, changed the course of history. And in remembering them, in telling their stories, we honor not just their memory, but the fundamental human capacity for courage in the face of impossible circumstances. Margaret Whitmore was an ordinary woman who lived in extraordinary times and rose to meet the challenge. Her story reminds us that history is not made by men alone, that women played crucial roles in the conflicts that shaped our modern world, and that the most powerful weapons in war are often not weapons at all, but the human mind, the human heart, and the human will to survive.